Hello. Well, after almost 3 weeks seemingly lost in the system, Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, has turned up in prison colony IK-3 of the Yamalo-Nenets autonomous region, generally known by the sort of nickname of Polar Wolf. Now, by chance, I happen to know a little bit about this particular prison colony, not because of anything to do with Navalny, but from previous work on Russian organised crime, particularly the Vori, for my book, incidentally, of the same name. And so I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the circumstances, the conditions, and what we can read into this. To start off with, the fact that he disappeared for so long, as I say, almost 3 weeks. Now, what it turned out to be, he was lost on what's called ETAP, which is essentially the Russian prison transport system. And what it tends to mean is nowadays that you, in a fairly straightforward way, if you're being transferred from one prison to another, you may be with 1 or 2 transfers. Get there. Back in the day, back in the bad old days of the Gulag and shortly thereafter, ETAP was indeed often a very lengthy process in which essentially you were just treated as human freight, purely there for the convenience of the system, and so you might end up being shunted through half a dozen different locations before you actually ended up at your final location. And in that time, you were kept incommunicado. Often you were frankly just kept inside the same train carriage. And that seems to be what happened to Navalny. I mean, by his own account, he travelled between Vladimir, which is where his previous prison was, Moscow, Chelyabinsk, Yekaterinburg, Kirov, Vorkuta, and then Kharp, which is the village in which his prison system is. Now, as I say, that to me strikes me as still slightly unusual by modern standards, and I do feel that probably they polished off the good old Gulag traditions really for Navalny's benefit, but also for wider political reasons. Because we've got to realise that the reason why the state has imprisoned Navalny is not just simply to take one particularly voluble, fluent, charismatic and thus dangerous political rival off the board. It's also actually as a deterrent to everyone else. And so in some ways, 20 days of where is Navalny? Is Navalny still alive? What's happened to him? Is a way of using that to basically once again remind people we have Navalny, and that means we could also put anyone else within our reach into this kind of system. So as I said, I think there is a kind of a performatively Gulag element to how this happens. And I should actually just mention, by the way, talking about the fact that he's incommunicado, but now we know, and indeed we've had this fascinating whole Twitter thread, or X thread, or whatever we should call it these days, about his experiences, which is still astonishingly upbeat. I mean, he actually describes himself as, how he opens it, I am your new Santa Claus, referring not just simply to the fact that he's now well above the Arctic Circle, but also that he grew a beard while he was on ETAP. And people wonder about this, and I get a lot of sort of snarky trolls in some cases, in other cases maybe just people who really just don't like Navalny for whatever reason, who's saying, oh, well, this can't be him and so forth, he doesn't have access to the internet. Well, he doesn't have direct access to the internet, but what he does have is access from time to time to his lawyers. And we know that he's already met his lawyer in IK3. And what tends to happen is that his lawyers then transmit his communications out and they become Twitter threads and the like. So, let's recognise that actually, as far as we can tell, these communications do indeed come from Navalny. Anyway, so having posted that he's Santa Claus, he also in his Twitter feed talks about the fact that this is a very different kind of experience. So again, going back to a sort of traditional, almost Gulag type experience. He says, and I saw a convoy. Convoy is used for the sort of procession of prisoners being moved from one location to another. And I saw a convoy, not like in central Russia, but like in the movies, with machine guns, warm mittens and felt boots, and with the same beautiful, fluffy shepherd dogs. Well, it's true. I mean, if you see any film representations of the gulags, they're almost certainly going to be in winter with the guards buttoned up in sheepskin greatcoats and big furry hats, barking dogs, their breath steaming in the cold and such like. That is closer to what he's now facing. So, we have to recognise what does this mean? What is his camp like? So IK-3 or I suppose technically IK-3 Yamalo-Nenets, since each region has its own separate constellation of labour camps and prison systems and the like, is, as I say, outside the village of Kharp, which is up in the Arctic Circle. I actually noted down the temperatures. As you say, it's very isolated and bloody cold. In winter, it routinely goes down to minus 26 degrees centigrade and can get down to minus 38 and worse. In winter, you've got maybe a couple of hours of weak sunlight and so forth. No surprise, frankly, that this is built on the bones of a Stalinist gulag camp. One of the reasons why the village itself, which is a very small village, is sort of perhaps disproportionately known, though, is because there are actually two, not one, penitentiary institutions there. And the other one is called Polar, or known as Polar Owl. It's actually IK-18. And this really is a very, very serious, it's a special regime, in other words, maximum security location for a relative handful, a few hundred, of the most serious murderers, terrorists and the like. Polar Owl is the kind of place that people get threatened with. As in, if you don't cooperate with us, we'll send you to Polar Owl. So by that context, Polar Wolf looks relatively benign. And I think it's a point worth making without in any way understating just how harsh this environment is. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific harshness and the risks. We should note that there are still worse places within the Russian prison camp system. I don't know. IK-6 Orenburg, for example, known as Black Dolphin. Again, one of the really maximum security places for the worst offenders. And the kind of place where even if prisoners are just being routinely moved from one part of the prison to another, say being taken to the exercise yard or whatever, they will be moved individually by, generally speaking, at least 2 prison guards, usually accompanied by a dog, and they will be moved in a stress position, essentially bent over, hand behind the back, in order to keep them off guard, off balance, and unable suddenly to act. I mean, these are the kind of conditions that people at Black Dolphin go through. Or indeed, one could mention, for example, the prison that's better known as Lefortovo in Moscow. Technically, it's CISO 2, at which, for example, the Wall Street journalist Evan Gershkovich is currently entombed. Technically, it's run, like the rest of the prison system, by the Justice Ministry. In practice, Lefortovo is the prison of the Federal Security Service, the FSB. And it's an old, again, Stalinist and before-era secret police prison. And one of the key attributes there is that prisoners are not even meant to see other prisoners. So when they're being moved around the corridors, the guards have these little metal clickers that they click just simply to say there is a prisoner transfer in progress. And the idea is that when other guards who may be doing the same thing hear that, you take your prisoner, you move them to these specially constructed niches in the wall and place them in there face to the wall while the other prisoner is moved past. So the idea is to create this constant sense of absolute isolation. So again, this is not in any way to understate what Navalny faces. It's just to say that unfortunately, and I think this is something that the authorities know perfectly well, they still have options. They can, should they choose, ratchet things up yet further. Because this is clearly a ratcheting up from the prison in Vladimir, in which he was before. So what does he face in this terrifyingly for a cold place? Well, the first thing is, look, I mean, there was no chance that Navalny was going to make some kind of movie-style prison breakout. But even if there were, I mean, this is the kind of place there is no escape from. You have the Arctic tundra on one side, you have the polar Ural mountains on the other, you have a hell of a long way before you get anywhere where you can possibly sort of hide and disappear. And, let's be honest, the key asset of the prison guard system in this case are their dogs. You know, the dogs are going to find you, they're going to track you down no matter what you try. It's worth noting there hasn't been, to the best of my knowledge, a single successful escape from this particular labour camp. As I say, you know, it's not that he was going to be trying that, but it gives a sense of just how isolated this place is. Because it's not just can people get out, it's can people arrive. I mean, it's interesting that his lawyers already have been there, but generally speaking, you know, this is a long, long way from anywhere. The village of Kharp itself has a population of, from memory, about 5,000, and it's been declining in recent years. It's not exactly the kind of place people move to for the joy of it. So, I mean, in this case, there will be that sense of physical as well as sort of moral isolation, especially because if past practice is anything to go by, the authorities will often be sticking Navalny in solitary for all kinds of generally rather spurious and obviously, again, performatively spurious reasons. It is, contrary to some accounts, on the Zona Telecom system. Now, this is a kind of electronic communication system specifically for convicts, and it's meant to allow them some degree of contact with the outside world. Now, I don't think that this camp is actually on the telephone element of Zona Telecom, because in some places you can actually, with all sorts of limitations and subject to being overheard, you can actually make calls. But on the other hand, there is clearly some kind of email access. Now, again, in the past, Navalny has historically been denied this. He's been accused of being exactly a serial offender against camp rules and such like. So the possibility is there that actually he may, or at least people who he talks to, might have access to Zona Telecom. So we might hear something from that. But again, I wouldn't really be holding my breath, because isolation is a key element of what they do there, and to him specifically. So there's just over 1,000 inmates at Polar Wolf. On the whole, they will be spending their days working in the various workshops, doing either woodworking or a variety of other sort of small industrial things, the kind of things that actually tend to happen in prison. What's interesting is that when the Wagner mercenary organisation was recruiting prisoners, they didn't send someone to Polar Wolf, but by all accounts there were quite a few applications from Polar Wolf. Obviously, fighting in Ukraine is still regarded as better than actually being at that camp. These days, obviously, Wagner is no longer recruiting, but the Ministry of Defence is. I don't honestly know if the MOD is recruiting from Polar Wolf. I imagine if there were volunteers there would be, but again, I mention that, but not for a moment that I think that Navalny will be signing up to go and fight. Instead, what we're likely to see is a continued attempt to kind of ratchet up that sense that he is isolated. In particular, because this is a red prison, not a black one. What does that mean? There's a general division of the Russian prison system between ones that are called red, in which essentially the state still maintains real control over what happens on a day-to-day basis, and the so-called black ones, which actually probably are still about a half of them all, in which actually it's the criminals who really control what happens day to day. I mean, that's not unusual. I would be fascinated to know what the proportion of British or American prisons would be considered in those circumstances, red or black. But anyway, the idea is that in the black ones, yes, obviously the prison system is there to ensure a certain degree of control. People don't run away, people do the work they're meant to do and so forth. But in practice, actually, the authority figures within the underworld themselves actually have a lot of sway over day-to-day lives. This one, as I said, is a red prison. What that tends to mean is, on the one hand, you tend to have less kind of random brutality and predatory exploitation of prisoners by other prisoners. But on the other hand, it does mean that the system is much more able to control not just people's movements and activities, but who gets to talk to whom. Can they ensure that the only people you're going to get to talk to are essentially informants? They can obviously arrange casual inmate violence if need be, but they usually won't. It's interesting, there is an account by one prisoner who served there. I actually had to print this out because I wasn't going to remember it. Miko Hulilidze, who said, when prisoners enter the colony, they're taken to the bathhouse. When a person undresses and goes to wash, the water is turned off and people in masks come in and start beating him. And he says that he was beaten for about half an hour. It may have felt like half an hour, but I think that's actually very hard-pressed, because he said there were 15 people, both prisoners and employees, beating him with batons and fists and things. So I think half an hour of that, you wouldn't really be surviving it. But the interesting thing is that I read a message from an organised crime figure who spent just over 3 years at that particular prison, who said that, look, as long as you don't mess with the guards, on the whole, the guards are not going to mess with you. Everyone's just basically doing what they need to do to get by in these fairly awful conditions. I suspect that one of the key distinctions is precisely between real prisoners, who are actually genuinely criminals, and political prisoners. I suspect that real prisoners, again, if they step out of line, they're going to be treated very harshly. This is, after all, a very kind of still old school prison system, shall we say. But on the other hand, the system will not specifically go after them. On the other hand, political prisoners may well face much more trouble. Now, having said that, I really don't think that Navalny is going to face anything like this kind of orchestrated, over gross physical threat. I think more exactly it's going to be isolation. It's going to be that sense of the very fact that he's stuck in this location, miles, hundreds of miles from anywhere that really matters. Spending much of his time, just moving from cell to workshop to freezing cold exercise yard and back to cell. Knowing that the people around him have probably been carefully selected precisely to be informants, so they're not people he can necessarily kind of engage with on a true human level. And that any time they want to, the authorities will decide that he has done something wrong and stick him in solitary. It's not at all a fun prospect. But the main thing is that, as I said, I am still humbled and astonished by the sort of humanity and the enthusiasm almost that Navalny still seems to show for life. And so let me end by just simply reading this thread that was posted on Twitter. If you've already read it, you can, if you wish, now turn off or whatever. But as I said, I really think it actually bears fully reading. So it's 9 short tweets. Number 1. I am your new Santa Claus. Well, I now have a sheepskin coat, an ushanka hat, the sort of classic fur hat with ear flaps. And soon I will get valinki, that's the traditional Russian felt boots for winter. I've grown a beard for the 20 days of my transportation. Unfortunately, there are no reindeer, but there are large, fluffy and very beautiful shepherd dogs. And the most important thing, I now live above the Arctic Circle, in the village of Kharp on Yamal. The nearest town has the beautiful name of, I'm going to get this one wrong, Labitnangi. I don't say ho ho ho, but I do say oh 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 when I look out of the window, where I can see a night, then the evening, and then the night again. The 20 days of my transportation were pretty exhausting, but I'm still in a good mood, as befits a Santa Claus. They brought me here on Saturday night, and I was transported with such precaution and on such a strange route, Vladimir, Moscow, Chelyabinsk, Yekaterinburg, Kirov, Vorkuta, Kharp, that I didn't expect anyone to find me here before mid-January. 5. And that's why I was very surprised when the cell door was opened yesterday with the words, "A lawyer is here to see you." He told me that you had lost me, and some of you were even worried. Thanks very much for your support. 6. I can't entertain you with stories about polar exotics yet, because I haven't seen anything outside of the cell. And outside the cell window, I can only see the fence, which is very close. 7. But I also went for a walk. The yard is a neighbouring cell, a bit bigger with snow on the ground. And I saw a convoy. Oh, not like in central Russia, but like in the movies, with machine guns, warm mittens and felt boots, and with the same beautiful, fluffy shepherd dogs. 8. Anyway, don't worry about me. I'm fine. I'm totally relieved that I finally made it. Thanks again to everyone for your support and happy holidays. 9. Since I'm Santa Claus, you're probably wondering about the presents. But I am a special regime Santa Claus, so only those who have behaved very badly get presents. This is a man who has been poisoned, who, on returning to his country in an astonishing display of both bravery and patriotism, was, as he'd predicted, immediately arrested, trumped up prison charges, sent to prison, has been, suffered all kinds of health issues while in prison, not surprisingly. Russian prisons are not the healthiest places at the best of times. B, he clearly is not being treated with the best of times. He's now been sent to what is, as I said, not one of the worst prisons in Russia, but, getting up there and then the sort of chain of worseness. and he's joking about being Santa Claus. That still, I will be honest, astonishes me. Thanks very much.